Okay. Looks like we're back now. So welcome to video 3 for this course introduction. And we are now on to diving into some best Photoshop practices. And in the previous first video, I went through, talked through the course syllabus, the major projects, what those are structured like. Last video, we looked at the individual project. We looked at how the discussion posts are going to work. And each one of them is giving you just some high-level information. You still need to go back and read that info within each one of those sections to make sure that you're all on board for this online modality. But now that we're getting into project one, I want to show you guys some student examples from the past and just do a quick brief overview of some of those and talk about some of the highlights and how these are coming together. I think this is always useful for you guys to check out. Okay, got it open. Cool. So this first one here does a great job of getting away from the idea of local color. This color scheme came from her reference image, and that's how she was able to pull out all these cool non-traditional colors. The trees do not have to be brown. The water does not have to be blue. You are welcome and free to do any color scheme that you would like. This piece has got a lot of great detail to it. This brings up an interesting facet. For whatever reason, when students think jungle scene, they think it needs to have some type of water feature. If Please know where your drawing skills are at. And, if you have never really done a lot of water before, if you have not done a lot of waterfalls, um, if you if you haven't touched it before, I'd recommend maybe trying to steer away from doing a water feature for this first project. It's just, you've got a lot of things that we're balancing out and figuring out within this design. And then can kind of work against you. In this case, it was very successful. The student obviously has some digital illustration background under their belt. There's some cool things that she's doing here. So she's doing something called depth of field, where she's pretending like the painting has got a rack focus going on with it to where the objects that are closest to us become a little bit blurry. That's always a really, really cool effect to work with. One of the other things that I want to point out within this picture is choosing where to put your details, right? So as we get back to the tree line here, we've got some really good gradients. We've got some loose drawings that are going on. We're not drawing every single little leaf back here, but there's still good light sources and there's still a good impression of where those trees are at, and building up that tree line looks really, really nice in the background. The detail is holding strong where we want the focal point to be, and she's really thinking through the highlights, the shapes, and the forms on each one of these objects, especially with the rocks, where the rocks have got a little bit of imagined bounce lighting happening with them. There's various colors and textures that are building up in there. This is an absolutely beautifully rendered plant in terms of the shape, the shading, the consistency of it throughout, and the overall framing and flow of this piece works really, really nice to bring you where it is that she wants you to be looking. Even though there is a super bright light source up here in the top right hand side, I don't think it's fighting too much with the rest of the shots within the scene. And yeah, this is just a really, really beautiful first project. This was very easy for me to give them an A. This next project here, we've got another one that has a ton of detail within it, and this feels like something from like an early Outcast album or something like that. So you can see that the painting style is consistent here. We've got a totally different rendering style. That's okay. There's a water feature within this one as well. The only part where the painting style differs is within the interior of this cave. And this brings up an interesting topic. So using gradients and using that fuzzy brush that they auto load you with within Photoshop when you open it is maybe not the best choice for you to be able to work within this class. The fact the rest of her painting is like cell shaded and shaded with forms and a little bit of texture. Throwing in this one random gradient within here is really a very abrasive kind of stark contrast through the rest of the piece. The other thing that's going on is we've got a lot of saturation and not a lot of light source going on within this shot. So that 70-30 rule, If she had darkened up some of these areas to give us a focal point that's a little bit more clear, it would not be quite so noisy and not so quite so busy to our eyes when we actually look at this piece. But there's a ton of effort that went into this, and this is why we're looking at these, because there's always things that we can improve and tighten up, and a better lighting source, some darker areas, and leaving things not completely in super high saturation all over the piece will help to soften it on our eyes. This one's a really nice example as well. It's a much different piece. The rendering for the jungle ruins here, to give you some alternatives for that, are really, really strong. The student did a great job painting the bricks within the shot. I think that these are extremely well delivered and well developed, with all the cracks and different layers within the rocks. Looks absolutely beautiful. You can see back here at the back that likely that is a photograph that they added some type of treatment to. Please do not do a photo collage for these projects. You do need to be painting this stuff yourself in there and not painting over a photo. That's not good. So that's contrasting and kind of fighting against the rest of the work that they've done within this piece. The lighting that they've established here on this animal, or this creature statue, could likely be a little bit darker, and then the lighting is not consistent with the leaves within the foreground that need to have just a lot more contrast to them. But the flower, man, they rendered the heck out of that flower right there, didn't they? Looks really, really nice. Okay, this is a great one to be able to talk about as well. As I have run this class over the years, let me check something real quick. Yeah, we're recording, right? Yeah, we're recording. Cool. So as I've run this class over the years, I've found that I need to put a large emphasis on making sure that you are doing a lush tropical jungle. Think South America, Costa Rica, Central America, Africa, rainforest. This happens to be an absolutely brilliant result in more of a medieval style forest, and it opens up the idea for what your jungle ruins can be as well. These happen to be extremely minimal. However, the rest of the composition is so strong and well developed with the art direction that it's an easy pass, and the work that the student put in on the swords is also extremely strong. He's got the highlights going on within the vines here, and there's all kinds of tight little details, so it's really, really well developed and thought through. There's a cool thing that's going on with the trees over here. You might not have seen this, and this is why it's good to look at your reference images from other well-developed and professional artists out there, where he's got his tree highlight, but around the highlight, he's gone through and outlined it to give it a secondary color, and it gives it this nice glowing effect that we're seeing here. That's also heightened by the gradient that he's using within the tree. And then we've got a really good bit of atmospheric perspective happening as the trees start to turn more blue and less saturation the further back we move within the shot. So there's a lot of cool stuff, a lot of nice little details that are going on within the groundwork, a lot of different colors that he's pulling in to make it the composition come together entirely. And this is just a beautifully done piece of work. For this one right here, this is maybe a good example of not having developed the ruins enough. And the shape here, right? It's a cool shape, but there's definitely, if this is supposed to be like a monolithic giant ruins off in the background down the path that we're describing, needed secondary details, probably needed a little bit more atmospheric perspective going on with that. The second big thing within this is that the bushes are not quite as rendered. Remember that first fern that I showed you guys? This is pretty lax, and for the amount of foliage that he has in here, as we start to look through these bushes, yeah, they're loosely rendered, but they still need a little bit more detail. There's a difference between working loose, but you can still work loose and still have a polished end result. The next thing within this one is we've got this tree over here on the left-hand side that's taking up roughly 1/6 of the entire composition. However, it's not really adding to the composition. It's not moving the viewer's eye in any kind of meaningful way, and this is just sort of creating dead space within the artwork. So there's a more interesting shape that they could have come up with for this tree form over on the left-hand side. This brings up an interesting point. This next example, you guys are welcome to go through and create something from feudal Japan, especially when we get to the medieval times project. I had not clarified clear enough that it's supposed to be a tropical jungle, and the student came up with this solution for the forest and the ruins. This is beautifully rendered. It's a very muted color scheme. Not everything has to be super saturated. There is a certain elegance to an understated color palette that's on display here. But the way that they've worked through each one of the trees and the rendering techniques inside of those trees is in line with Oriental or Asiatic art. And it turned out, I think, really, really beautiful. So you're welcome for the medieval scene as well, or any of the others to do an environment from that region of the world if you would like. This one's pretty cool. So we've got a jungle swamp. The thing that makes this one really successful is the reflections of the object within the water. Once again, we're getting a tree here that is not really helping the overall composition. It is creating a nice little frame for what it is that we're supposed to be looking at because it's balanced with the other tree. Why this one works and the other one has some issues is because we're seeing the little holes that help to connect us to the water, and as the light's actually moving through it is really nice. This has also got a an appropriate use of the brush tools to where they're very small, they're not dominant within the piece, and I think that overall for a first one out of the gate, this is a very very unique solution here with some interesting color rendering that they've built up. So we've got the oranges, we've got the tans, we've got some blue and some greens within this dome. Yeah, so this next one, definitely a non-traditional color scheme that's happening, and it's a really cool perspective with some great plant shapes that are taking place within this shot. This is another example of if you're going to work very stylized and with sort of a minimalist approach to how you're treating these jungle scapes, you still need to make sure that the details, if we only have a few of them, are really polished and look finalized and well considered. This leaf form here is really dark and it's taking up a lot of our attention. And the final rendering on this could have been with the shape language and the shapes that they're using for the highlights could have been more well developed on the inside. But overall, it's a cool color scheme, good forms, but the polish just isn't quite there on that one. This one is an example that, again, that has that minimalist kind of look to it. However, it's much more successful. There's more work that can be done on this plant within the foreground, but I would direct your attention over to this tree where even though it is a minimalist tree, we've still got a secondary and a tertiary level of detail. I mean that within the branch itself, we still have some lighting that's going on with it, and then we've got some indication of how the bark is working. And on the vines, even though they are very minimal, they still have a highlight, and the lighting is working overall throughout the entire scene in a successful manner, and the level of polish within the bushes is working, and the shape language within the rendering, it has got some energy and it feels well layered and energetic, right? Look at how many different bits of brushwork are happening here to be able to build up this foliage in a very unique and interesting way. And it's, you can work simple, but you also still have to make sure that you're working intelligently and that this stuff is coming together and working right. I don't think this is the final one for this piece. I think that she went back and added quite a bit more detail to it, but it's on its way to being a great piece. This one, again, not a jungle forest, but this is one of the most unique color schemes I have ever seen when I've run this assignment. I've never seen a watermelon pink and teal forest environment before, and it's very, very unique. When it comes to polish, this is something that I've talked about quite a few times before. This is as polished as you could ask the line work to be. The shape language is really, really great here. We've got a good flow of thick and thin lines within Photoshop. The shading and the trees are describing the way the lighting is hitting it around the bark and really working its way around there is very, very beautifully done. This is another great example of just a beautiful drawing. The lighting could probably be integrated a little bit more in some areas. There was a lot of work that was taken on for this environment. And overall, I think that it turned out very successful and has a good attention to the details that are within it and a good light source. This is an example of one that maybe needs to be pushed a little bit further. So we've got a symmetrical shot that's happening where things are pretty balanced on either side. And yes, we are creating a frame for us to look through onto our sculpture. However, the foliage is not fully developed. This is an example of overusing the stamp brush tools to where they become the dominant rendering factor here without actually going through and doing the work of rendering and trying to let those carry you. And it just looks well, quite a bit unpolished and unfinished. There's more work that could have been done on the tree bark here. The grass covering foliage is not fully developed as well, and I expect you guys to be able to create more polished renderings than what we're seeing in this instance. The stones right here could have been developed out quite a bit further compared to some other examples that we've seen. Yes, it does have some steps, but those steps, when we go in a little bit closer and actually look at the line work on the steps, are it's not it needs more polish and refinement in a lot of big ways. Same thing goes for your statue. The ruins in this case, if you do a statue as your ruins, we want to make sure that, you know, if this has got wings, that they are very clear and well developed for the rings, and that we're wings and that we're developing a sense of lighting on this that's working successfully, right? So some of this line work here is not the best and not really that clean. There's some things that could have been improved on that one. This is one of the more unique color schemes as well. So this student always had a clever idea. This was, I think, the first time I ran this class, and I've learned a lot about what to tell you guys along the way. So these trees back here needed more rendering, but the idea is that the vantage point for this is super unique. The ruins are that this is an ancient structure within the village that the young men, for their rite of passage test, have to try and climb to the top of this log, and if they fall off of it, well, then they land on the spikes and the briars. And you can see that these spikes and the briars still needed a little bit more work, but the overall composition is very successful. It has a lot of movement and a good color scheme going for it. There's just more stuff that needed to be fixed and developed. This one is really fun to be able to talk about also. So there's some great stuff that's happening here. This rope bridge, when we talk about telling a story within your environment, it really tells a wonderful story of the history of this rope bridge that's dilapidated. You can see that they've thought through, you know, with the little piece of rope that's hanging down there, the way that the rope is coiling around. This is a living object that they've created within their shot. It's very nicely done. The other big thing here is that the panther's head for the ruins this is very nicely done. It looks great. However, I've talked to you guys about the development of the ruins themselves. Likely did not think through the rest of the design of this space enough. We could have connected more foliage around the base of the ruins for stuff growing up it, and it starts to look sort of like a birthday cake design. It's still got some cool lines going through it, but there's the details here, if that's the door in the entryway, is well developed, but there's big swaths of empty space here that just needed to be thought through quite a bit more outside of those kind of glowing lines on the outside of it. When you start to get into Mayan ruins and Mayan design, whew, boy, that stuff can really start to break your hand pretty quickly. But yeah, so there's some good parts and then some things that could have been improved just a little bit further. This one is a good, solid, high B level piece where all the right pieces are there. The framing for it is nice. The building could have been rendered just a little bit better. There's some nice texture that's happening with the grass, some good color schemes that are happening, but overall, good tree shapes as well, good rendering on the trees, good use of texture within the trees. That's really nice up there, a highlight. But yeah, it's just a really well balanced, safe piece. This one is really cool to look at. So this student had done a lot of speed painting in the past, and this looks like something straight out of a game development or a level within a video game. And this is a good example of where to spend your time on the details. So when we look at the entire thing, we get it. It's got a nice focal point here. Over here on the right-hand side, you can see that the brushwork is still there. It's still layered. It's still been considered, but we're not going through and painting every single leaf into these dark green areas back over here, whereas we are painting a lot more of the leaves into the foliage for where we want the focal point to be. Here you can see the same thing up and over here where she's got really thought through the shape language of these rocks. Those are right on track to be fully developed and photorealistic if you want to take it there. But we've got the little trees that have been figured out also. Within the foreground, the big silhouetted trees in this section needed more work. They needed some more greenery or some low lights that were happening on them. But overall, I mean, it's just a really cool vision and cool concept that they developed here. All right. This one's fun. So this is one that has some line work going on with it. It's also got a great color scheme to where it's not just green, but we've got some blues. The brushwork inside of the line work is really expressive and nice. We've got some cool ruins that are going on here that have a good secondary and tertiary level of detail, a good focal point that's happening within the shot. And I think for a first one out of the gates, this is extremely expressive. The shape language is really nice within this piece as well. And, there's always more that we could have done with the highlights, but I think that this is for the light source, it's doing everything that it needed to do, especially on the ruins right here, with it catching a little bit of the light on the statue's edge of his lips and the edge of his face. All right, so this one is maybe an example of water gone wrong. One of the areas that I see students, if you haven't done water before in the past, is thinking about all the grass and reeds that happen right around the water's edge. And this is also an example of an overuse of the fuzzy brush, where everything starts to look like it's painted on satin or on like a silk cloth painting. And our brush strokes just aren't that confident and really well developed with any of the bushes, right? So this looks like a nice soft throw pillow. It doesn't particularly look like a bush when we zoom in on it. Yes, the water has a lot of detail, but if the student had looked at more examples and renderings of water and how other artists had completed that, this might have a little bit better structure as the water starts to stream down and feel a little bit more better connected. So I hope that that gives you guys some things to think about for these initial steps with where you're heading with your projects. Next up, we're going to be getting into Photoshop. So I'm going to create a new file within Photoshop and run you guys through what the setup looks like. So setting up within Photoshop. You might start off with your canvas at 72 DPI. You want to make sure that you change this resolution right here to 150. Remember, we're working at 150 DPI. That's our good Goldilocks zone within this course. If you're on inches, picas, points, whatever, turn it over to pixels and make sure that you make the width 1920 by 1080. So let's create a canvas that's 1920 by 1080. And I've got, when I'm working in Photoshop, your Photoshop, as you open it up, might end up looking a little bit like this. Photoshop over the years has continued to kind of take up the real estate space for the designers. I like to have as big of a canvas and open air space within Photoshop as I can possibly get. So I'm going to click on this little tiny arrow up here on the right-hand side and collapse these things down. If it's not collapsed all the way and it looks like that, you can grab it in the middle and pull it over with your left click mouse to open things up even further. What I like to have opened up within my Photoshop and free is going to be my layers. So I'm pulling things from the window section. So I've got my layers. I'm going to open that up. You can drag that down and up to give you some more space to be able to see. Here's another quick tip for you. Within the layers, it's got a little hamburger menu right here in the top right-hand side. If you click on that menu with a left click and you go into panel options, you can change the size of the thumbnail view within the layers so you can see it a little bit more clearly when you're working within Photoshop. Next thing that I always like to have open is the navigator. So the navigator, usually pull it up to about this size, is going to be my thumbnail view that I can constantly check on within my piece. This also allows me to be able to zoom in and out of my piece quite a bit quicker at any time that I want, rather than having to go all the way to the left, select my magnifying glass and hold down the Alt key to be able to zoom in or out. It just makes your life quite a bit easier this way with the navigator open. Oh, boy. Excuse me. So we got our navigator. Last thing I like to have open is my history. back in the day in Photoshop, you used to not be able to Control Z. If you wanted to undo things, you had to go to the history. They have remedied that, but it still is a good way just to be able to back up if you've made too many choices very quickly and get to exactly where you want to be. All right, so we've got our canvas. We've got our toolboxes opened up that we're going to need to be able to paint. Next thing that I always like to do within Photoshop is to click on the little plus button down here within my layer uh, window, and that's going to create my first new layer. With my first new layer, I want to click on my color swatch over here on the left-hand side, right in this area, and I want to go to a middle gray. That middle gray, I'm going to click on my fill tool, which is right above the little finger that's pointing down, and I'm going to fill my canvas with a middle gray. Why do I do this? Well, when I'm painting, this is going to keep me from fighting against the whites and making my scene too saturated. When oftentimes when you have a fully white background, the tendency is to want to make the colors super, super bright. Within Photoshop, while we're painting, we really want to stay away from this top right-hand side within the color picker. We really don't want to use pure white, just a little tiny bit of pure white. We really don't want to use pure black. There's always a more interesting color. What we're working with within Photoshop is just sort of this magic square here. So this sort of middle square is where we want the vast majority of our tones and colors to come from, because once you go all the way to full saturation neon like this in the top right hand side, your only option is to stay guttered up here at the very top of your piece, and then it creates a lot of problems. So be mindful of that. As you're working with your reference images, you'll likely see that most of the artist works their colors are going to stick within this sort of golden square. Think of it as having like a picture frame around it and working inside of that picture frame for where you're picking your colors from, but you should be picking your colors directly from your reference image. I'll show you how to do that next. Okay, other things to be aware of within Photoshop. Let's go to the brush tool. I just hit B on the keyboard to get to the brush tool. A lot of times Photoshop is going to default you to this airbrush. This airbrush is not your friend. It's really good for things at the end, but for the most part, we're going to be working with the hard round brush or some of those specialty brushes that I've given you guys, like the Ultimate Tiles, Ultimate Pencil Hard, can work really, really nice. It's got just a little bit more texture. I'm still in the blue. There we go. And it gives you just sort of a textured line. Next thing that I want you guys to do and be aware of within Photoshop for the brush that you might not know about, but this will help your drawings immensely, especially at 150 DPI, is to turn on the smoothing. So up here in the top panel or the right-hand side, right now the smoothing is set to 0%. I like to use my smoothing set up to about 20 to 25%. On this machine that I'm working on, it seems to be a little bit more reactive, so I'm going to 25%, but that'll allow you to be able to do nice straight lines. The next thing that I want you guys to be aware of here is what a simple brush setup looks like within Photoshop. Under the drop down, this is going to give us the thick and thin lines as well as a transfer line. And I'm going to talk to you about when to use the transfer and when not to. So under the window drop down or hitting F5 on your computer, you've got the brush settings. By clicking on the brush settings, we've got a couple different things. Looks like this one's already been preloaded. So we're just going to go into the basic brush. So our basic brush, we've got the smoothing turned on. That's great. 25%. First thing I want to do is click on Shape Dynamics. So if I click on this and actually select the word that says Shape Dynamics, and I go in there and I click on Pen Pressure where it says off and go to the drop down and go to Pen Pressure and I start to draw, suddenly the shape of my brush changes. So if I'm pressing down very, very lightly on the scene or on the screen, I can get a very thin line. If I press down harder, then my line is going to become thicker. That's going to give you that nice ebb and flow Disney-esque type of line. When I'm going through and doing my concepting and my rough sketches and my well-developed thumbnails, I usually like to turn my opacity down to about 50%. What this is going to allow me to do is to be able to not commit to that final saturation, and I can start to build up and over my lines to what I want my final idea to be. Another thing that you can do when you're concepting is to turn on and doing your rough sketches and your well-developed thumbnail is to turn on the transfer. So the transfer, by turning on the pen pressure, is going to cause that nice little S-shaped line that we created to be really light at first, almost non-existent. And as I start to press down more, it's gonna start to show up. This is mimicking a real-world pencil or Bic pen that you might sketch with, so that you can get your thin lines, you can get your thick lines when you're really sure about them, and it'll help you to develop your ideas and your concepts further. All too often, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be drawing on this layer. We want to first gray layer just to stay gray, and then make sure that you're creating a new layer for your line work that you're going to be creating. So we're working in a manner that is non-destructive. I really don't need, I can turn off the transfer once I get done. I can collapse my brush tool and just hide it, somewhere down by the bottom where I'm not really going to go too often, and just pull it back up when I need to, or pull it from the window up at the top when I want to turn that transfer on when I'm going in and doing my final line. Whew, a lot of information here, I know, coming at you really fast. That's why it's good that these are recorded so you can go back and watch them. Definitely don't want to watch this in 2 times speed. I think I would sound like Alvin and the Chipmunks. Next up, what I want to show you guys is one of the other reasons why I like to create this gray frame in the beginning. It's so I don't burn my eyes out after spending, 10,000 hours inside of Photoshop and drawing on a computer screen. I already have glasses. So the next one is this crop tool. So the crop tool, we usually think about it for shrinking our canvases, but when we're doing digital painting, it can also be very useful for extending our workspace. So if I want an image that's going to go past 1920 by 1080, and I imagine that there's going to be some type of camera movement within that shot, the camera panning down or panning up, then I can grab the edge with my crop tool selected and pull up to be able to give myself that extra space. Just creating a new layer so that you guys can see. All right, so now blue layer is the base. We've got our first flat layer here, and this gray square that I created right at the very beginning is still sized for 1920 by 1080. So I can right click in the gray area over here and go to duplicate, just hit enter. And now if I hold shift, I can move it up on the same plane, and then I can drop down the opacity or whatever it is that I want to do. And I can get a good idea very, very quickly also by selecting that crop tool. It'll snap to the top layer. And so now I have two screen widths that are 1920 by 1080. So I know exactly what is going to be on a full screen where within the shot. And this is just a smart production technique whenever you're working within studio or storyboard requirements. Starting with a 1920 by 1080 canvas and then expanding it out from there to a second one, and yeah, sort of keeping it within a ratio for the 1920 by 1080. So next up, what I want to show you guys is dropping in your reference images within Photoshop. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to fill my blue layer again. This time, let's go ahead and make it black. Okay, so this black layer over on the left-hand side, again, removing all colors so that there's not a big bright white contrast and I can see my colors that I'm using clearly. I've got my working canvas over here on the right-hand side, which are my two gray squares. I'm going to be working above those two gray squares. We'll just go create a new layer and call it Sketch. You can also, within these layers, right-click underneath the eyeball and give it a color. I always like my sketch to be red just so that I can spot it very quickly. Over here on the left-hand side is my gutter. This is where I'm going to start to drop in my reference images. All right. So for the reference images, I've got this picture that's going to be useful to me. And I'm going to pull it in and drop it right there. Let's get some more reference images within this space. Scale it down. And I'm just creating sort of a mood board, a kaleidoscope of the images over on the left-hand side for my reference images. These are all smart objects. I really am not going to be editing the original one. So if you want to turn off the smart object, you just right click within the gray area within your scene, and you can go to rasterize layer. Where is it? Yeah, down there at the bottom, rasterize layer, rasterize layer. Um, shouldn't really affect you too much, but the vast majority of the time, you're going to be going in and hitting the I tool on your keyboard, finding your middle tone. That's sort of a good middle tone for your background. And as you start to do your flat shading, you're going to start filling that in with your brush at 100%. The 50% is just for your initial sketches. So the initial sketches, we've got a good brush set up for that. I like to do my initial sketches in anything but black. Blue, red works really good to be able to start working here. And I've got my reference images in there. And then this is a more developed one with the actual sketches that I'm going to be using for the example project as we move forward. I want to break this down for you so that you can see. This is something I didn't mention previously, but within each one of the modules for this class, so under Project 1, Welcome to the Jungles module, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, I've got my previous example projects, my Photoshop files in there for you guys to be able to download and see how I'm working with them. I'm doing sort of a breakdown or a pullback on those projects right now. So right now I've got my reference images in there. There's my first sketch layer, and this is what I came up with for my first sketch. Now, some of these things are not going to work. They're not, as you continue to develop your sketch out, it is totally fine to move and push and pull some of these objects around. So if I use my lasso tool over here on the left-hand side and go to Edit, Transform, and Distort, with my sketch, I can really start to bend and push this sketch at a very early stage, oops, to make it to make it work and make it feel accurate. After that, you don't have to leave everything on the same layer within your sketch. You can have the sketch build up in multiple layers. At one time, I want to use a bridge like this over here on the left. That's where I was going to head for my ruins. But then I came up with the idea of, oh, I like the idea of having a woolly mammoth carved out into the jungle wall somewhere. But then I decided, hey, if I want to do a bridge with a big old woolly mammoth on here for no good reason, then why don't I just go ahead and create a full-on elephant bridge within my shot that they developed or built later on. And so we're going to have these two kind of cartoony looking elephant stylized designs, woolly mammoths, where their trunks come together and then create a bridge that people can walk across. And the plan for this would be that my character within the shot or within the scene would be jumping across these rocks, come, stand up, and then look up. The camera pans up to do the reveal of the big ancient ruins for the elephant bridge trunk. And that's what this shot would be within my scene. And yeah, you can see that I'm starting to add, even on another detail, I'm going through while I'm developing these reference images very quickly on thinking and making little mental notes for myself for where moss might be hanging down and how that, if that's an element that I'm introducing, how I can work that into the rest of the shot throughout my scene in a successful way. There's still a lot of development to go through on this initial sketch as I start to finalize that well-developed sketch, but I'm getting my general shape language here and starting to really think about what the trees and shapes are going to look like within the different sections and what the rhythm and how thinking at this stage on how I'm moving the viewer's eyes through the actual painting. All right. Other things that I was going to tell you just a second ago. Oh, yeah. Last thing I want to show you is within the movement tool. So the move tool up at the very top of your toolbar. If you're just opening up Photoshop for the first time, the auto select might be on. The auto select is very, very frustrating. Go ahead and turn that off by clicking the auto select off. And if I hit B on my keyboard, I get into my brush. If I hit V on my keyboard, I get into the move tool. And the move tool is how I'm going to be moving very quickly between the different layers within my project. So right here, I've got my very base sketch is the layer that I'm selecting and turned on. But if I want to select my elephants, what I'm going to do, and this is the reason why I like for you guys to have a 3-button mouse, is I'm going to right click and I can see my layers. This is also one of the reasons why at this stage I do not have all of my folders grouped up. The grouping just makes it a little bit more difficult, grouping them in folders to be able to select the layer that you're trying to get to for this paint stage. We're going to turn this method on its head and do some cleanup when we get to project 4. But for now, you can have messy Photoshop files, things for the techniques of painting, lighting, shape, form, texture, compositional flow that are more important on this first project than how cleaned up or well documented your layers are. And all I need for you to turn in at the end is not your Photoshop file, but rather your JPEG file for me to be able to look at. We're interested in the end results here within this course. But using the hitting V on the keyboard to get myself quickly to the layer that I want to go into and paint is going to work really well. I can hit the I key to be able to select some of my coloring and then get back to one of my new layers, or at least the general area for where I want to be. And then I can start to paint in very quickly. Oh, what I just did too to change my brush size here is I'm hitting the brackets. So just the brackets on your keyboard, right next to the P key on your keyboard. P key brings you to the pen, hit brush. Within my brush, I can hold down the left or right bracket, and that's going to change my brush size very, very quickly while I'm working through on my painting. All right, I think that is all the suggestions that I have for you guys for getting these projects set up. If you have any questions, please give me an email. And thank you so much for hearing me out on this stuff this evening. Oh boy, I think I did not have my screen shared the entire time. Uh-oh. Okay. We'll find out here in a little bit. All right. Y'all have a good night.